Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
Generation. I was born in 1971, so I became an adult in 1989, 1990, at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet bloc, and also at the time of Tiananmen. And so for me, for my generation, or at least for someone like me, I was too young to be tempted by communism in the Soviet form or Maoist form. So some people who were born 10 years before me or 20 years before me or more, had this experience as a sort of direct believers in these models, which I was never tempted by this, just because it's not that I was smarter than my older generation. In the 1990s, I was much more liberal in my thinking and a much more sort of center left or even center. I was a much stronger free market believer than what I am now.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Professor Thomas Piketty. Thomas needs no introduction and we will jump right in. Thomas, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thanks for your invitation.
So I was reviewing your works in the run-up to the preparation of this interview, and it's a daunting task, and given time is so short. I wanted to start with your central thesis of R greater than G in terms of economic inequality. And I wanted to start with Global South because I have two things in mind. One, the situation that we are seeing with emerging economies where they are struggling, and also historically countries like India, but a lot of countries in Africa and elsewhere, they face a situation where the rate of return on capital is not necessarily high, and at the same time, growth is also not high. So while your book deals primarily with a situation where rate of return has been historically very high, I mean, starting with pre-industrial Europe to the 21st century, we see a situation in the global south where rate of return itself is very low, and that has a very negative impact on growth. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that the rate of return, is really a rate of return on capital is to a large extent an expression of class struggle, both at the domestic level and at the global level, and the rate of return to capital, varies a lot across assets. So, including in the South, you can have some very high rate of return of capital, some very low, and you have to look at who's getting what. So, at the global level today, or, let's start with the North, people who have little saving, who have, 10,000 euro or 50,000 euros, or, they've not been doing great in terms of rate of return over the past years. Well, with inflation, they got a negative rate of return, and you have lots of people in the South certainly who also got a negative rate of return. And then, if you look at the top of the distribution, you have positive and very high rate of return. So this is something I was already emphasizing in Capital in the 21st Century, which was published almost 10 years ago, where I was looking at for instance, the rate of return to university endowments in the US, large, very rich university, poor universities, or, universities with no endowment at all. And basically, the bigger the endowment, the higher the rate of return, because you have access to assets and typically, very sophisticated global financial assets, derivatives, commodity derivatives. When you're very rich, you don't put your money into public bonds with close to zero rate of return. And even when it comes to rate of interest on public bonds, I think it's important to realize the enormous inequality across the world. So, people in the North have been very happy over the past 5 to 10 years of, about the miracle of zero interest rate. But, the other side of this miracle is the fact that, in the South, the interest rate on public bonds has been, in some cases, pretty high, and this has been very costly for the taxpayer of the North, and this has been very costly for the public finance, the taxpayer of the South, and this has been very costly for the public spending of the South, and some people are making high profits out of that, including in the South, but to a large extent, this reflects a very unequal global financial system with sort of exorbitant privilege of rich countries, which for a long time we were talking about the exorbitant privilege of the dollars, and people in Europe were complaining about that. But in fact, if you look at the past decades, we have something like an exorbitant privilege of the rich world, including both the US and Europe, which, partly with the creation of the euro, but, more generally, the main centers in the north of the global capitalist system are benefiting from very low interest rate, partly because there's a lot of saving from rich country and rich people all over the world, who want to have, safe assets in the north, and they feel their wealth is well protected in the banking system of the north. This also reflects financial regulation, which in effect forces banks to put a bigger part of their assets into the public bonds of rich countries themselves. So anyway, this is just saying that the rate of return is not an homogeneous concept that applies everywhere, or even everywhere in the same manner, or even in the same manner within the north or within the south. It reflects class inequality. It reflects a very unequal set of institutions which allow some groups and in effect some social class to access, in some cases, very high rate of return, in some other cases, very low or indeed negative rate of return. And it is the same at the time of borrowing. People have access to very different, a rate of interest that they have to pay. So, when I summarized my some of my findings in my book 10 years ago by R bigger than G, it's really important to stress that R is not the same for everyone. It's a complex concept reflecting, power relations, both at the domestic and global level.
You did stress a lot about the G, though, in your book, that G is not uniform. It depends on commodities to commodities. Purchasing power for some commodities have gone up, and you mentioned about bicycles and so on. But yeah, I didn't see a lot about the heterogeneity of the R in your book that you wrote, obviously, 10 years ago. And
Well, you will see. No, if you look at the chapter where I deal with the global R bigger than G, you will see the table on rate of return to university endowments in particular, where the only reason for looking at this university endowments is simply that these people publish a lot of information. So, you have these 800 university endowments in the US, and they've been publishing pretty detailed data on their wealth portfolio for the past few decades. Whereas if you look at the Forbes billionaire, you actually see very unequal rate of return as well, but you don't know very well, what comes from different portfolio allocation, what comes from the other institutional aspect, because you actually don't know a lot about what what they really own and what they do with their money. The only good thing at the University of Endowments is that they actually published very detailed portfolio, and so I have a couple of tables in Capital in the 21st Century looking exactly at this.
I wanted to come to China next. Your World Inequality Lab report has been giving us important data, and one of the things that we are seeing is very rapid rise of inequality, levels of inequality in China. And I want to bring this for at least two to three reasons. But let's start with this. What are your thoughts on what are some of the reasons why we are seeing rising levels of inequality in China recently?
The two communist giants, Russia and China, when they started to privatize a lot of their assets, created a lot of inequality in effect, because the way it was done was in effect allowed small group of individuals to take control of a lot of assets. So of course Russia is the extreme case, has become the sort of world capital of oligarchs and probably the country in the world using tax havens the most, together with Gulf countries and oil monarchies, which is ironical in a way, because just Russia and oil monarchies are countries with very little redistribution, progressive taxation, or in fact no progressive taxation at all. So you could say, elites in this country should not try to avoid taxation because there's little tax to avoid. But what this reflects is the fact that probably the elites in these two countries are not so confident that the political regime is going to remain like this forever. So they actually use tax havens a lot to protect their wealth. So anyway, Russia is a sort of extreme case where, oligarchs have become, extremely rich very quickly at the fall of the Soviet Union. So China is a less extreme case because, the big difference, of course, is that the Communist Party of China is sort of still in control of the situation and has been much more careful than post-Soviet authorities to try to, keep control a lot more of what was going on. So they did not privatize everything. They to a large extent, the public-private division in the property structure has stabilized since 2008. And, over the past 10 years under the Xi Jinping era, you have a sort of new regime of property structure with, about 30% of everything there is to own in China is public, 70% is private. Now, in real estate, it's almost everything is private. So if you take aside housing and you only look at the company sector, which arguably is the most important part of capital ownership, then it's actually more 50-50. So the public share in total ownership is quite large. So it's very different from the post-Soviet privatization where almost everything was privatized. But still, the 50% of the company sector that was privatized and the 90% of the housing sector that was privatized is very unequally distributed, because there's very little attempt to make it more equal. One example for what I have in mind, which I like to quote, is the fact that China and Russia are also, these are two countries where there's no progressive taxation of inheritance at all. So, which is quite striking. So, if you are in East Asia today, and if you are about to die and you want to transmit your wealth to your children, you should go and die in communist China rather than in capitalist Japan or capitalist South Korea or capitalist Taiwan, where, you have an inheritance tax with top tax rate around 40-50%. There are ways to get around them, but it's not so easy. And, in any case, these are the official rates that you're supposed to to pay. Whereas in China, there's nothing at all. It's just 0%. So, which is ironical for a post-communist country, or actually a country that still claims to be communist. So, you privatize a lot of your assets, and then those who became the new property owning elite can transmit to their children, without any taxation. And Hong Kong, is the incredible example of a country that became even more unequal and oligarchic after they joined a communist country, and they repealed actually their progressive inheritance tax after they joined communist China. So which illustrates the sort of the power of ideology, and in this case, the power of the transformation, the sort of post-communist transformation of ideology, and the failure of Soviet communism or Maoist communism, in effect, was instrumentalized by the new property owning elite in Russia and also in China to build a new set of institutions that will allow them to accumulate a lot of wealth and still preserve their legitimacy and their ability to perpetuate this over time.
And it seems some of the problems of inequality, at least in China, didn't come to notice in the early decades of this century, perhaps because you guys were not bringing up as many data, but also perhaps because G was high in China to begin with. And, now it's not the apocalyptic vision that the Financial Times presents, but there are certainly slowing down of G. And, if we apply your thesis to China, then, we might see continuation of these problems of inequality that your data has shown us.
Yeah, well, of course, as you were saying, the general improvement in living standards can
for our viewers, G is growth and R is return on capital.
Right, G is growth, and growth has been very high in China. It's going to continue to be high. Of course, it's going to decline gradually, but there's still a lot of room for convergence in living standards with the West, and this big rise in average living standards, is of course the main factor of legitimacy for the regime. Now, is this sufficient? Is this enough? I think if there were more possibilities to mobilize politically and to build, coalitions with more democratic unions or political parties, I think you will see a lot of protests. So, the fact that people are happy with the growth of the economy and living standards is certainly important, but it's not enough. I mean, if that was enough, I think the political regime, the Chinese regime, would be a lot more relaxed about authorizing democratic unions and parties and everything. And the fact that they are not relaxed at all about this, I think, is also a testimony of the fact that they know the limit of their own power and legitimacy. So that's the equilibrium that we have today. And in Hong Kong, which was the only place where there was a kind of electoral process that was potentially threatening for the people in power, this electoral process was destroyed almost entirely in recent years. So, it's not just that people are happy with the IG, so it's okay. It's there's also political repression to make people happy, or at least to make people forget that they are not so happy. But as you say, with the gradual decline of G, this is going to become more and more complicated to make people forget about the inequality. So, which is why, the Chinese regime is not just another, oligarchic regime like the Russian regime, who really need a strong repression. To some extent, they also need nationalism. They need war in order to preserve themselves. The Chinese regime, is more sophisticated in a way. I mean, they also need repression, of course, but they have managed to build a sort of new form of balance between public ownership and private ownership, which gives them capacity to invest in the country, I'm certainly not saying that they do everything well and that this is the best regime. A lot better could be done, and a lot more, much more democratic organization could prevail, and hopefully at some point will prevail. But at least they are trying as much as they can, while protecting their own power and their own sort of bureaucratic elite and new capitalist class. They are also, they've been building forms of institution to promote some kind of balance, socio-economic development and regional investment. So it's a pretty sophisticated political construction. It's not just oligarchs, and repression. It's more subtle than this.
I wanted to come to your policy recommendation, which is to simplify it, is progressive taxation. And obviously, like, a lot of people misunderstand that, thinking, oh, Thomas is saying is just squeeze capital as much as you can and you will solve the problems of inequality. But what you are essentially saying, as I understand, um, is social mobility, is basically taxing the super rich, or a sort of effective tax, progressive taxation. My question is, given you are suggesting taxing those who are super powerful, I think you say super managers or something like that, are you optimistic that this can be achieved under liberal democracies? Because under liberal democracies, we need to win elections. And, there is this very standard question one of my Marxist professors used to ask us, like, if you want to win elections, who do you go to? And most of the people coming from political science background would say we go to voters. And he says, you are wrong. And so you are not a politician. You go to those who have money. They give you all sorts of, from helicopters to everything that you need, from advertisers to media. So are you optimistic that this kind of progressive taxation that you are suggesting as a way out is even possible under liberal democracy?
Yeah, it's complicated. It takes huge political mobilization and social struggle to achieve more equality in general. Let me be a bit more specific. First of all, I'm not saying, taxation is going to, and progressive taxation is going to solve everything. So if you look at my most recent book, in particular, my brief history of equality that was published last year, I really, there are really three pillars for the kind of democratic socialism and participatory socialism that I envision for the future. First is the continuation of the building of the social state, that developed in particular in the 20th century, and the sort of gradual decommodification of the economy with the education sector, the health sector, to some extent the transportation, the energy, the environmental sector. So there's really a process of gradual decommodification of the economy that is a lot deeper than just redistributing income or capital, if you want. Now, in order to make this process work in the 20th century, and in order to make it continue in the 21st century, this has to come with a perception of fiscal justice and social justice, and this is where progressive taxation is important. So to summarize, you cannot just make the welfare state and the rise of the social state. This cannot simply be paid by the very rich. You need the middle class, the lower middle class to pay for it. But if you want the middle class, the lower middle class to accept this, you need to make sure that the rich are paying tax rates that are at least as high as what they're paying, and if possibly a lot higher. And I think in the 20th century, this was really the development of Roosevelt type progressive taxation in the US and in Europe, was very important to make the development, to make possible the development of a new sort of social contract where everybody would sort of accept to pay more tax to develop the social state. So building block number one is the social state. Building block number two to facilitate the development of the social state is progressive taxation. And building block number three, which is maybe even more important than the first two, is a more democratic distribution of power, including in terms of transformation of labor law, property law, and including, in my view, the development of worker control in company and having, so redistributing wealth and capital is important, but even without any capital ownership, you want workers to have voting rights in the board of corporations, and in companies that are very small, maybe you want those who bring capital to have still a majority control as compared to workers. But as the company gets bigger, so I make some specific proposal as you move from 10 workers to 50 workers, 100 workers. But as the company gets bigger, shareholders, individual shareholders should have a cap on their voting rights, which I say no more than 10% of voting right in a company with more than 100 workers. But this governance part of what I'm talking is to me is as important as progressive taxation. You need the two together. If you just as one, I don't think it can work. Now, politically, how do you get there? Well, every step in history toward more fiscal justice, involved enormous transformation in the balance of political power. So, it's always been complicated, whether at the time of, the French Revolution, if you want the nobility to accept to pay more tax, that's not going to be voluntary. This happens through enormous mobilization, to say the least. And, in the 20th century, when you think of Roosevelt type of progressive taxation, it came after enormous political shocks, World War I, World War II, but even more importantly, in the case of the US, the Great Depression, which sort of, created a lot of anger against the capitalist elite who had sort of enriched themselves without, solving the problems that were important to solve for the rest of the population. So is this kind of political situation going to happen again in the future? Of course, nobody knows, but I think it will be a mistake to imagine that these conditions that I just described, French Revolution, interwar period, are completely unique and will never happen again. I think in particular the challenges of global warming and the kind of climate catastrophes that we are starting to see can typically trigger a change in attitudes toward free market capitalism and toward people taking their private jets and at the same time giving lessons to the rest of the planet about what they should do. I think this political attitudes towards this class can change very quickly, very fast, just like what we've seen after the Great Depression, after Ancien Régime, misery, and it takes big shocks for political mobilization to happen. But then, what I am mostly interested in is not so much to have shocks that are as catastrophic as possible, because there's nothing positive in catastrophic shocks as such, but rather to analyze the sort of positive transformation and positive mobilization process through, political organization, trade unions, and platforms for institutional transformation, including the fiscal system, the legal system, the educational system, because in the end, these are these collective platforms that were able in the past to transform political shocks into positive transformation.
We are almost there, but does your time permit 5 more minutes? I have two very quick questions.
Okay, very, very quick because
Yeah,
I have to
very
go.
brief. I wanted to ask you, about human capital, because I was having the Maoist period in China, where there was a significant leveling up of the material inequality and political inequality, while cultural inequality was not leveled up. And some of the impact of that we are seeing now after opening up, why people from rich families who had the cultural privilege are now doing much better. So tell us a little bit about your vision of leveling up human capital, given we are seeing so much of privatization of higher education in particular. And secondly, very quickly, it's complete injustice to you. But I was just curious, and especially being from the left, how do you look at the period of Maoist China and the Soviet Union in general?
Yeah, yeah, these are really big questions. I belong to a generation. I was born in 1971, so I became an adult in 1989, 1990, at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet bloc, and also at the time of Tiananmen. And so for me, for my generation, or at least for someone like me, I was too young to be tempted by communism in the Soviet form or Maoist form. So, some people who were born 10 years before me or 20 years before me or more, had this experience as a sort of direct believers in these models, which, I was never tempted by this. Maybe just because it's not that I was smarter than my older generation.
You
Probably I
visited
just,
the Soviet Union, if I'm not wrong.
sorry.
You visited the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I visited, but when it was collapsing, and
Just
I
collapsing.
visited in 1991 the first time, and then 1992, and then my wife, now my ex-wife, but she was the mother of my three older daughters, is a historian, actually a social historian of the Soviet Union. So I've been many times in Moscow when she was working in the archive in the 1990s, and she was sort of studying the sort of social history of the interwar period in the Soviet Union, and at a time when archives were just opening up. Well, they have closed again since then, by the way, but there was a time in the 1990s, early 2000, where archives were relatively open, and for the first time it was possible to study the social history of the Soviet Union. And so I've been there a lot, but I've been there at a time when it was a complete collapse of the system. And basically what I saw, in Moscow, or what I saw in Eastern Europe when I was traveling there as a student in 1990, 1991, was a complete failure, basically, complete failure. So in fact, in the 1990s, I was much more liberal in my thinking and much more sort of center left or even center I was a much stronger free market believer than what I am now, partly because of this experience, because
Right.
just like the world in general in the 1990s was much more a free market believer, because the collapse of the Soviet model, it was so clear that it was a disaster. Now, of course, when I look at this today, I have a more balanced view, in the sense that starting with the Tsarist regime before 1917, there were achievements in terms of education, health, public infrastructure, in particular in the interwar period or until the 50s, which, other regimes could have done better, other regimes could have done worse. I mean, you have to be, but certainly the complete refusal of any kind of democratic balance of power, either in elections or in companies, with, in fact, very little worker control, very little in terms of democratic union. Yes, this is very different from the way, when I look at, when I talk about democratic socialism or participatory socialism for the future, I am thinking much more in terms of continuation of the social democratic model of the 20th century than of the communist experiment of the 20th century. So most of what I've been doing, in the past 2 or 3 decades, by revisiting the history of the distribution of income and wealth over the past 200 years, is basically to say, okay, look, the Soviet communism or Maoist communism was a large failure, but social democratic countries in the West were able to build a system with more equality and more prosperity at the same time, which in the end, has achieved a lot. And what's important is to consider this achievement not as a frozen product, not as a finished product, as a finished system, but as a first step towards something that that can continue. So when I talk about participatory socialism or democratic socialism by the end of the 21st century, it's of course very different from what we have today, and it will require a very different balance of power to get there. But at the same time, it's very different from the system we have today, but I would say that it's not more different, as compared to the system we have today, than the system we have today is different from the capitalism of 1910, with no social security, with colonial, patriarchal, authoritarian regime, which today, in spite of all the limitation in the education, health system, in spite of all the problem with private money in politics, in the media, which you were referring to earlier, is very different from what we had 100 years ago. And, I think, this evolution could and should continue. So this is the way I've been thinking about that in my research.
And do you think the cultural difference between a Thomas Piketty's daughter or son and that of a peasant in Africa can be leveled up within a generation?
Within a generation, I don't know, but so that I was talking, by the end of the 21st century. But everything is possible. Things can accelerate. The world of 1914 and the world of 1950, in terms of social equality, both in the north, in the south, with the decolonization process, things can accelerate in 20 and 30 years in an incredible way. Now, in the case of 1914, 1950, of course, it came with enormous political shocks and an incredible succession of shocks, which I'm not sure it would be good to have the same sequence today, and it would be great to have equally fast transformation in a more peaceful manner. Is this possible? I'm not so sure. But, again, if you look at this history of institutional transformation in the 20th century, I think it came mostly from collective mobilization, social struggles, more than outright violence, in itself is not producing, is neither, necessary nor sufficient to produce positive institutional transformation. And, positive institutional transformation is not going to stop today. Conservatives in every political, period, in every historical period, always say, things are going to stop like what they are exactly today. So maybe some transformation of the past were necessary, etc. But now, it's over. But it's never over. It always continue, and it will always continue.
On that note of optimism and activism, Thomas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a
Have
lot.
a wonderful rest of the day.